Black Labor, White Wealth by Claude Anderson. Introduction. Racism against black people has been a virulent undercurrent in our society for hundreds of years. In various forms, it insinuates itself into all aspects of our lives. Yet it is not an acceptable topic for discussions anywhere, neither the conference room nor the living room, especially across racial lines. It is as if we believe that if we ignore the fact of racism, they will not exist. That is not the reality. It is time for a serious dialogue and a change in black strategy. Neither the dialogue nor the strategies can be emotional or superficial. Instead, they must be based on facts and knowledge and considered for the purpose of understanding not just the symptoms that we see all around us, but also how things came to be as they are and how, as blacks, we can revise or reverse our misfortunes and strengthen ourselves as a racial group. It is critical that we strengthen our group because while as individuals, some of us may hold high ranking positions in corporate America, government agencies, and our own businesses, and some of us may reside far from the scene of black despair. All blacks are identifiable members of one racial group. Furthermore, as a racial group, we are powerless, impoverished as a group. Okay. Furthermore, as a racial group, we are powerless, impoverished, and increasingly unable to compete in America. And whether they intend to or not, those outside of our group see us as one group. The predominantly marginal living conditions of black America did not happen by accident. They resulted from much forethought and planning by whites. European whites who came to this country in 1607 were the first power group in America. They wielded power in a manner that is natural to the human race. They had a chance to a new government in a country filled with resources and potential for wealth. They seized a unique opportunity to structure a government and a system to their sole advantage. To secure their advantage and increase their power, they subordinated and exploited another race of people, blacks. The purpose of this book is to illuminate and examine the strategies and techniques that were used by whites to accomplish their goals of solidifying power and privilege. Once black Americans understand the strategies and techniques that whites use to build their power, they can use those same tools to build black empowerment. The history of slavery and the struggle for equality serve as a guide for the future. While the dire conditions of black America can be traced back to measures that colonial governments used against blacks, it does not end there. We have further handicapped ourselves by some of our own beliefs and behaviors. Our dogged pursuit of integration is one example. In so doing, we have destroyed our communities, diluted our numerical strength, and become dependent upon others. We have been further handicapped by our inability to practice group economics in a capitalistic democracy. We have always been a capitalistic element in the national empowerment plans of others as a source of free or cheap labor. Yet we have never had a national empowerment plan of our own. We have never used our collective intellectual resources to create a national plan with explicit policies and strategies for our economic and political gain. Black Labor, White Wealth provides useful information and a conceptual framework to stimulate thought, discussion, and planning towards that end. Chapter 1 describes and analyzes the present day conditions of Black America and establishes links that the antebellum conditions of slavery. Chapter 2 discusses concepts of power and focus on the ways groups acquire and institutionalize power. Chapter 3 describes the social and economic impediments to Black empowerment, including the certain behavior patterns and ideological beliefs that diffuse and weaken our sense of direction and unity. Chapter 4 and 5 explain why Blacks were selected for enslavement and why we cannot change our conditions by emulating Asians, Hispanics, or other ethnic and racial groups that immigrated into this country. Chapter 6 tracks the nature of the development of Black white relationships in connection with the wealth building process. Using comparative tables, charts, illustrations, drawings, and visual timelines, this chapter covers 5 centuries of social practices and devices that create wealth and power imbalances between Blacks and whites. Chapter 7 explains the national public policy that has guided institutions in their manipulative use of Blacks. The conditions and the conditioning and supportive systems for controlling and keeping Blacks powerless minority are also discussed. Chapter 8 explains why certain major problems will coverage will converge with the next generation to make Blacks a permanent underclass unless Black America takes immediate preventative actions to avoid this catastrophe. To the end, Chapter 8 offers practical courses of action that Blacks can take to achieve community cohesiveness, change detrimental social psychological behavior patterns, and to develop a new type of leadership that will help Black America develop itself into a competitive group in a rapidly developing pluralistic society. Finally, Chapter 9 describes the concepts of building vertical businesses or structuring a system of businesses around an area of Black dominance, such as the music industry. This chapter also includes discussions of sports, another area where Blacks have a strong dominance, which, if properly leveraged, could create vertical business opportunities. Some readers may think this book is too pessimistic because it doesn't pay homage to the positive aspects of Black white relationships. Others may question a book on Black history that does not highlight the individual successes of Black people. But such Black achievements have been recognized and discussed by many other writers. This book breaks new ground by offering a hard and honest look at how best resolve a 400-year-old problem that Black and white conservatives and liberals would like to wish away or bury beneath debates or on less complex issues such as abortion, sexual harassment, or a balanced budget amendment. Black Labor, White Wealth is written to re-engage the reader emotionally and intellectually in the profoundly unresolved Black or white race issue. The purpose of this book is not to criticize any group of people, but to analyze history and propose a reasonable solution. All too frequently, Blacks are admonished to forget slavery, but to do so would be foolhardy, especially at this time, because the major problems facing Black America are rooted in slavery. Thus, we must squarely face that tragedy and learn from it, lest we be doomed to be shackled by it forever. Black Labor, White Wealth, Chapter 1: The Nature of the Problem. It isn't that we can't see the solution, it's that we can't see the problem. The Los Angeles, California riots had subsided, but the acrid smell of the burned wood and tar still hung heavy in the early morning air. A local television reporter scanned the crowd and spotted a familiar black community activist standing by a burnt out grocery store. Sensing a good soundbite, the reporter asked for an interview. The bright lights came on and the reporter began. 3 decades after the civil rights movement transformed the nation, why is the black community dissatisfied? Why have they rioted and destroyed their own neighborhoods? What is the problem? The activist cocked his head and, in a voice mixed with anger and indignation, responded, "Surely the gains of the civil rights movement in the 60s were important, but they turned out to be superficial and largely symbolic. We can sit at lunch counters and vote, but economically, civil rights gains took more from us than they gave. Some blacks got important big paying jobs and white businesses or government. Sure, we have our Colin Powells and Oprahs, but black masses were left behind. So you see, integration came at the expense of black community. Now things are worse than ever. We have more killings and crimes, more school dropouts and drug users. Integration killed our communities. We have no black economic structure to solve the problems of our communities. Our black churches and families are weak and struggling. We have yet to gain control of our communities and our destinies. The Vietnamese, Korean, Indians, Iranians, Mexicans are putting up profitable businesses in our neighborhoods. And we are still hopelessly vulnerable to every danger from police brutality, violence, and poverty. The next time we go to the Supreme Court, instead of integration, maybe we should seek separate but equal. The white newscast forced a smile and said, "But with all the civil rights laws and blacks who have been elected to public office, surely things are better for blacks." We happen to be What happened to the dream that Dr. King spoke of so eloquently more than 20 years ago? Exaggerated. The activist shook his head and walked away. At home, he waited for his interview to appear on the evening news. He had tried to explain the causes of black people's pain, confusion, disappointment, and anger. He cursed himself for not talking about black people's tiredness. How tired they were of being the world's underdog. Even so, he hoped the world, he hoped the world would be watching and listening. As the riots covers aired on television, he saw close-up shots of faces of distressed blacks, looters scrambling in the background. He heard an elected official saying now was the time for healing and coming together among blacks and whites. He watched, but his interview never aired. The words of the reporters played again and again in his head. Surely things are better for blacks. As a black activist pushed the off button on his television set, a chipper weatherman concluded the news saying, "Sunny skies tomorrow." Black Labor, White Wealth. Chapter 1: The Nature of the Problem. The problem and its root. The newscaster's assumption is shared by millions of Americans. We ask each other, what has gone wrong in the black community? What's wrong with blacks? Why can't they act like other ethnic or racial groups in America? Talk shows seek answers from leading black personalities who, when asked about problems of black America, mouth well worn platitudes. Perhaps they are fearful of raising the ire of mainstream America, or perhaps they're simply naive. Nevertheless, the solution these blacks urge address only the symptoms afflicting black America, not the cause. The root of the problem within black America is not teenage pregnancy, drugs, and decline of family values, anger, rap music, unemployment, or even the epidemic of violent crimes. These are only symptoms of a deeper problem. The root of black communities across America is race and unjust distribution of our nation's wealth, power, and resources. One race, the descendants of white Europeans, seemingly has checkmated blacks' effort to improve themselves. Whites live in privileged conditions with nearly 100% ownership and control of the nation's wealth, power, businesses, and all levels of government support and resources. White society has a monopoly of ownership and control. This monopoly of control results directly from centuries of abusive exploitation and expropriation of the labor of a darker race, black Americans of African descent. Though black Americans reside in the richest nation on earth, their standards of living is comparable to that of a third world nation. Blacks own and control less than 2% of the wealth, power, and resources of the nation, so they have little control over their lives and the conditions in which they are forced to live. Both the disparity between white and black living conditions and inequitable allocations of resources are century old problems. They are a major legacy of the peculiar institution called slavery. It was that social system that a white patriarchal society co-signed blacks to live in the most inhumane conditions doing the hardest labor without just compensation. The dominant white society felt that by stripping the black slaves of his humanity, all of his worldly possessions, his personal freedom, and keeping him hopeless, that blacks would be forever non competitive and powerless. Needless to say, the dominant society's experiment in social engineering worked. The living conditions of a people, enslaved or free, tend to reflect their status and power within the larger society. Conditions in Black America are no more or less than what was planned for them centuries ago. Solomon Northrop, a free black who was kidnapped into slavery but later escaped, described the living standards of slaves in 1841 as befitting beasts of the field. He wrote about extraordinarily dehumanizing conditions that stripped slaves of their individuality, their labor, and often their lives. Slaves lived in dilapidated, damp, dark cabins, and their worldly possessions consisted of a few rags, a small board, and a stick of wood served as their beds and pillows. There were no physical, financial, nor psychological conforms for them, and worst of all, slaves were intentionally kept without hope. A slave's life was committed to producing wealth and comfort for white masters. The slaves suffered in silence, but routinely asked in their prayers and work songs, "When will life get better for us, Lord?" This Their descendants collectively still await an answer. Legal and extra legal measures were taken to keep both the free blacks, like the slaves, in an independent state and excluded from enjoying the fruits of a nation that their labor was building. Free blacks were forced to survive or perish off the marginal resources that extended into their communities. One of the first lessons that free blacks learned was that without money and power, freedom for a black skinned person was freedom in theory only. They were still bound by their conditions and non white skin color. The larger society kept them bounded by making black skin color a badge of inferiority and degradation. Blacks with Blacks who escaped the plantations were not permitted to escape the boundaries of their own flesh. In reality, the social economic conditions for blacks outside of slavery were only slightly better than those within the slavery system. Being free for a black person meant being quasi free. A black was free as long as he could prove he was free, and even when he had only a marginally greater choice concerning how he lived compared to his enslaved brethren. In 1841, while Solomon Northrop lamented the terrible conditions of more than 4 million black slaves, approximately 386,290 quasi free blacks throughout the North was being subjected to Jim Crow practices and multiplicities of local ordinances and social sanctions that prohibited them from sharing fully in an affluent American society. They were forced to survive in poverty and social decay. In the shadows of the American dream, blacks' freedom was little more than a cruel and satanic joke. Local ordinances and social sanctions in the North and South restricted free blacks from earning competitive income. Their labor was solid their labor was sold for just barely above the cost of slave labor. Without sufficient income, few were able to secure decent food, health care, or housing. They remained legally free but sought safe havens in large urban areas in the North, such as Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and Boston. The free black populations in and around these or any other large cities rarely exceeded 2% of the total population. These black these blacks lived off low quality food and had few worldly possessions. According to Leonard P. Curry, author of The Free Black in Urban America 1800 through 1850, more than a third of the black population in cities like Boston lived in blind alleys, cellars, and lofts. Their poor and unsanitary living conditions created rampant health problems and shortened their lifespan. Curry further stated that in 1855, Boston's city register, Dr. Hosea Curtis, found that the death rate among blacks was 99 times higher than whites. Today, 150 years later, the mortality gap between whites and blacks have narrowed only a little. Social pathology and inferior living conditions, not genetic, continue to control the life expectancy of blacks. In the mid 1800s, the living conditions for free blacks were so desperate that nearly 50% had no choice but to seek some form of public welfare. In order to survive, large numbers of blacks publicly acknowledged that they were in a helpless state and were incapable of feeding, protecting, sheltering, and educating themselves and their children. Many black families became so desperate that they voluntarily re entered slavery to survive. Others turned to public charity. But nearly every black who sought some form of public relief was refused. They were chastened for being uneducated and were called lazy and irresponsible for bearing children that they could not support. Curry indicates that in Cincinnati, a typical northern urban area, out of 3,269 cases in which the city granted relief to the needy, only 10 recipients were black. And the assistance offered these fortunate black recipients was only for their own burial expenses. Public assistance tended to be distributed to whites only, including able bodied male immigrants, while aid was denied to black widows with small children. With the exception of a small number of abolitionists, dominant societies was indifferent to the living conditions of free blacks. Rather than blaming white racism and slavery, white society blamed blacks for their conditions, even though the conditions were not unique to Cincinnati or Boston. Similar horrendous conditions existed throughout the North and eventually gave rise to what became urban black ghettos that symbolized the conditions of blacks. The Emancipation Proclamation and subsequent constitutional amendment legally freed all blacks and granted them city citizenship, but without social and economic resources, these newly granted rights amounted to little more than paper rights. The government refused to compensate blacks for their prolonged servitude by providing them with the necessary tools and resources to transition from a dependent labor class to independent, competitive citizens. Instead of aiding blacks, whites expected and urged the newly freed slaves to fend for themselves. They could work, seek public assistance, steal, or disappear. Since free blacks could not find work, were denied public assistance, and often could not leave the country, they had no choice but to accept what the dominant society offered them: sharecropping, which was only but another form of servitude controlled by white plantation owners. Black Labor, White Wealth. Chapter 1: No Light at the End of the Tunnel. 130 years after slavery, American society has become more pluralistic and competitive, but blacks' marginal conditions remain relatively unchanged. In some respect, they have worsened. The socioeconomic inequality that existed between whites and blacks during and shortly after slavery are now structural. For example, on the eve of the Civil War, records indicated that more than 50% of free blacks were pauper. All free blacks collectively held less than 1/2 of 1% of the nation's wealth, with wealth being defined as a great quality of money or valuable goods or resources within both the private and public sector. A century later, in the 60s, an era considered by many as great decade of progress for blacks, more than 55% of all the blacks in America were still impoverished and below the poverty line, and blacks barely held 1% of the nation's wealth. According to the 1990 census, approximately 40% of all black families are receiving public assistance, and the number is increasing with more than 56% of all black female headed households beneath the poverty level. Black unemployment has not significantly improved in comparative terms over the last century. According to Curry, a historian, black unemployment exceeded 40% in the 1850s. The National Urban League, NUL, 1992 State of Black America report differed with the U.S. government figures, indicating that the hidden and true unemployment rate is approximately 28% for black adults and nearly 55% for black youth. The NUL's discomfort index further indicated that black unemployment worsened between 1960 and 1990, while economic conditions for white society improved. Blacks' lack of progress was reflected in the fact that blacks earned 53% of what whites earned in 1948. In the 1990s, after nearly 50 years of civil rights activities and affirmative action programs, blacks earned 59% of what whites earned. Further, the 1990 census indicated that blacks per capita net worth is $9,359 versus $44,980 for whites. Like their ancestors, blacks today have the same set of options, and they still lack employment opportunities in public jobs or black businesses because most white businesses are inaccessible in the suburbs. They still are denied or expunged from public assistance roles, and they have yet to learn how to disappear. Many blacks have turned to crime. They are therefore criminalized in order to seek substance and wealth. And just as in the previous centuries, blacks continue to be disproportionately represented in this prison system. Curry indicated that in 1850, for example, blacks constituted 60% of all persons incarcerated in Maryland, and half of them were under 16 years of age. During the same time period, in the state of New York, in the states of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, blacks made up more than 50% of the prison population. Today's prison rolls show similar percentages of blacks. Approximately 38% of all black males in America have either in prison on parole or probation. Still, they are luckier than many of their counterparts who annually fall victim to the homicide crisis, which each year claims more lives than the total number of American soldiers killed in either the Korean or Vietnam Wars. In the final analysis, Black America remains trapped in a dire dilemma. Some organizations have tried to call the nation's attention to the plight of blacks. In 1990, a 5-year report by the National Research Council, NRC, a Washington-based research organization, indicated that infinitesimal social and economic gains that blacks made during the 1950s and the 1960s largely ended in the 1970s. The Washington Post, in June 1990, summarized the study reporting, "There has been no significant black progress for the last 20 years, and a great social economic gulf now separates blacks from European and other ethnic groups in America." Unfortunately, the NRC study received little media coverage or public response, even from black civil rights organizations. Most blacks are concerned about what is happening in their communities and to their race, even if the media and power structures are not. They actively participate in the political process and complain to their elected representatives about the worsening conditions, but the political system seems unable to stimulate change. Harold Cruz, a black historian, believed that among those do who do care about the black problems, nothing is being done because no one knows what to do about it. Considering the magnitude of Black America's impoverished and powerless state, Cruz is probably right. But why is it that society does not know what to do? Is it that the leaders of this society lack knowledge or resources to solve the problems of Black America? Or is it that they lack the incentive and commitment to create viable means for blacks to empower themselves as a group? Why should this nation's leaders do something to address the fundamental problems affecting blacks? The answer is simple. The United States' superiority among the industrial and agricultural world powers was achieved because of the exploitation of blacks. This exploitation established and now maintains a privileged racial class whose wealth and power explains and legitimizes the system's inequality. Wealthy conservative whites control both public and private sector resources and tools that have kept blacks impoverished and powerless in a racially competitive society. Black Labor, White Wealth, Chapter 1. Conservative Forces, the Bane of Black Society. Conservative social forces are protectors of the status quo and the good old days. After using government to amass wealth, power, resources, conservative white power structures have long espoused social political policies that reflect their pull up the gangplank mentality. Powerful white conservatives profess commitment to capitalism and insist that wealth stays in the hands of the private, wealthy class, which has most benefited from the inequalities in the system. They rigidly oppose any societal changes regarding race and resources. This places them in direct opposition and in conflict with blacks. Conservatism, of course, comes from the root word to conserve or hold on to what one has. In essence, the conservative attitude towards blacks is, if you don't have it, we are not going to let you get it. When considering what should be done for blacks, conservatives have espoused a role and solution for blacks that have not changed an iota since the country was founded. Conservatives believe in the natural order of human beings and have always preferred the blacks to play a servile role in society. In many ways, white liberal policies have been injurious to blacks and those of conservatives. Neither the liberals nor the conservatives have offered any programs or resources for improving overall socio-economic conditions of blacks. While conservatives have consistently sought to sink blacks' ships, liberals have simply rearranged the deck chairs on the sinking ship so that the blacks would be more comfortable. Conservatives and liberals have historically approached black issues differently. Compared to ambiguous liberal approaches, conservatism is typically straightforward concerning the issues of race. It is not difficult to uncover conservative intentions in programs and public policies. Conservatives boldly proclaim that their position reflect the sentiments of mainstream society, as well as the principles of the first European settlers who established a self-serving system that made it easy for them to hoard wealth and power. It is this imbalance that conservatives seek to conserve. They frequently say that blacks are poor because they have unacceptable attitudes and behaviors and have failed to take advantage of opportunities because they are basically inferior human beings. Over the past 3 decades, national opinion surveys that have reported a growing conservatism among white society. Undoubtedly, some of it is a response to the growing uncertainties of time. Societal clashes on such issues as abortions, family values, immigration, taxation, gender issues, and crime have contributed to the popularity of conservatism. However, the core issue of white conservatives spring from the race. They oppose government policies and programs that hint at the redistribution of public and private resources and power to benefit blacks. Modern conservatism began its ascendance in the late 1960s as the white backlash to the civil rights movement, Black Power protests, and urban riots. The demand of the black protests for improved living conditions through more wealth, power, and community control shocked and frightened white society, which responded as it frequently does in time of civil turmoil and uncertainty. The privileged class appealed to conservatism to reassess the supremacy of white authority and its exclusive claim to power and wealth. Black Labor, White Wealth. Chapter 1. Breeding Black Conservatism. Black conservatism is as old as black enslavement. But 3 decades of popular white conservatism, coupled with the social and economic devastation of Black America, has attracted an increasing number of blacks to the conservative political movement. Black conservatives represent a potential danger to their race because of their alignment with the white conservatives, who have always been anti-black. When black-white conservatives alignment occur, black conservatives become a liability to blacks and an asset to whites. By mouthing the social and economic views of white conservatives, black conservatives convert confusion of their personal racial identity to a confusion in the minds of black people about the real issue facing them. Black conservatives operate under misleading colors. As an old farmer said, they run with the hounds while pretending friendship to the brotherhood of the rabbits. The confusion caused by their schizophrenic behavior provides a public cover-up for anti-black attitudes and activities and make them appear as nothing more than white racists in blackface minstrel makeup. Becoming a conservative has historically provided personal rewards to individual blacks with few downsides because of the powerlessness of the black community to hold accountable those members who turned against it. Blacks found that it was not difficult to establish beneficial relationships with whites once they accepted a subordinate position and committed themselves to placing their welfare of white class first. Once that was agreed upon, tactically or otherwise, blacks were entitled to various forms of paternalistic protection, Christianity charity, and meritorious recognition. White conservatives then conferred special status and recognition to conservatives, blacks, as exceptional or acceptable. Accordingly, black conservatives who place their personal advancements above the welfare of their race often gain significant personal and financial benefits, recognition, and access to power. They are anointed by whites as leaders and taught as a role model. In political and social institutions, a black conservative is closely akin to Sambo in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. In an historical context, a Sambo was a black American's worst nightmare. The stereotypical Sambo was more than a minstrel man, a buffoon, and a plantation darky. Sambo represented the extraordinarily success of social control, which was the ultimate goal of a slavery conditioned process that transplanted a white mindset into a black personality. Black labor, white wealth. Chapter 1: The symbolic betrayal of the black race. The term Uncle Tom is not an appropriate label for an individual who is white on the inside and black on the outside, and sells out his race by placing his personal gains with whites ahead of the rights and gains of his people. Contrary to popular usage of the label, the character Uncle Tom was not the culprit in the Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom was a brave man with dignity who cared about his family and race. The real villain was another black slave named Sambo. He was totally committed to the white master and used every opportunity to undermine the other slaves. Sambo, in many respects, was like today's black conservatives. Sambo always followed the white slave master, Simon Legree, and offered to show him how to tree the coons. It was Sambo who beat Uncle Tom to death, both for refusing to whip a black female slave or sell out his people. Uncle Tom tried to empower his people by understanding and beating the social and political structure wherever he could. Uncle Tom felt that it was important to get his people across the river to freedom. He risked his life to do so. The Sambo character personified a very successful social control created by conservatives. He was such a successful phenomenon that the concept he personified became a greater danger to blacks than the Uncle Tom. As blacks move forward structuring policies of racial accountability, it will be very important for them to know who helps and who hurts the race. Sambo was the black slave character in numerous novels and movies who was willing to put a weapon and defend his white master against the approaching Union army or hide the master's silver from northern carpetbaggers. What is the difference between the fictional Sambo characters and today's real-life blacks who joined the conservative movement to argue against affirmative action, black reparations, and set-asides? They declared that the world is now colorblind and are opposed to any policies requiring whites to share the social economic burden that centuries of slavery and second-class citizens have imposed on blacks. Isn't espousing a colorblind, race-neutral, melting pot society a modern way of hiding the master's silver? What are black conservatives conserving when black America is burdened by poverty, crime, unemployment, homelessness, and other social pathologies? Based on historical treatment alone, there should be a general antagonism between blacks and conservatives. Though conservatives claim that they are not racist, for centuries they have opposed programs and policies to help blacks. Andrew Hacker, a white writer, provided insight on this in his book, two nations, black and white, separate, hostile, unequal. Hacker asserted that their persistence in the belief that members of the black race represent an inferior strain of the human species. Of course, the belief is seldom voiced in public. Most whites who call themselves conservatives hold this view about blacks and proclaim it when they are sure of their company. Since white conservatives share their true feelings only in the privacy of other whites, there is a strong possibility that black conservatives do not know how white conservatives truly feel about them. Black Labor, White Wealth. Chapter 1. The Black-Jewish Alliance. It is often a conclusion of popular history that blacks and Jews have always shared a strong alliance. However, in their struggles to escape bondage and second-class citizenship, blacks have had few temporary and no permanent allies. At various times, abolitionists, liberals, and individual Jews have provided visible support to black causes and sometimes at great personal risk and expense. They have lobbied states and federal legislative branches of government, contributed financial resources, provided surrogate leadership, and given their lives to assist blacks. But these contributions were made by individuals and not by Jews as a class, religious or racial body of Samaritans. Prior to the 20th century, there were no recorded public commitments of Jewish organizations to help blacks. Beyond their good intentions, neither the abolitionists nor individual Jews achieved great success in helping blacks due to a major philosophical flaw in their strategies. The flaw in the abolitionist strategy was that they did not recognize or treat slavery as an economic issue that it was. They made the abolishment of slavery a moral issue, which it was not. As a moral issue, the abolitionists appealed to the conscience of slaveholders concerning rights and wrongs. These appeals did not damage the slaveholders' profit of slavery. By not treating slavery as an economic issue, they perhaps unwittingly supported slavery and undermined their own anti-slavery argument. They continued to use rather than boycott slave-produced products such as cotton goods, tobacco products, table foods, alcoholic beverages, iron products, and jewelry made from gold and silver. They could have withheld their monies from their shoe industry, insurance and shipping companies, and other businesses that directly and indirectly made their profits from black slavery. After Reconstruction, the effort of the individual Jews to assist blacks were flawed because they encouraged blacks to do something that Jews themselves did not want to do: assimilate into the broader white culture. Jews helped blacks to secure civil and voting rights, but these legal rights, through important and principles, gave the appearance of making blacks self-sufficient, when in fact these gains could not appreciably change blacks' wealth and power base. Worse still, the socio-economic alliance between Jews and blacks did not emphasize blacks' learning and self-sufficiency skills and strategies mastered by Jews. From the beginning of the alliance in the 1900s, Jews kept their problems and blacks' problems in perspective. Jewish problems came first. Jews did not totally identify with blacks. Jews fleeing persecution in Europe in the first and second decades of the 20th century entered America just as blacks were being forced back into separate but equal worlds of Jim Crowism. The majority of Jews were poor, liberal, and alone. Some were sympathetic to black problems and allied with them against racial bigotry. In the 1920s and 30s, blacks returned the favor by aligning with Jews against religious bigotry and oppression. The alliance benefited each group and presented a common front against some common conservative enemies. The alliance ultimately gave black access to a high level government and the corporate world. In return for Jewish support, blacks gave Jews carte blanche access to every aspect of black society. Jews established neighborhood businesses that survived strictly off of black customers. They advised black leaders on public policy matters. Jews also built entire industries around resources that blacks controlled or owned, such as sports, entertainment, and music. For nearly half a century, Jews were officially endorsed as the liberal intermediaries between whites and black America. The alliance began to break down as blacks became increasingly disenchanted with their lack of progress and stagnant socio-economic conditions. As the social fortunes of Jews and blacks began to diverge, the relationship became more paternalistic. Black organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and the National Urban League, as well as independent black leaders, were advised to pursue social integration, upward mobility within mainstream society, and civil rights. Black leadership was convinced that once blacks had attained integration and civil rights, the quality of life would naturally improve for all blacks. After all, the strategy worked for Jews. As the society began to soften its virulent anti Semitism of the 1940s, Jews used their newfound mobility to secure wealth and power for themselves. However, a decade after the 1954 desegregation decision and the civil rights movement, not only had black Americans' socioeconomic dilemma not been resolved, it was getting worse. Blacks outside of the traditional civil rights organizations became convinced that the only way to improve the conditions of black America was for blacks to take complete economic and political control of their communities, institutions, and culture. Many voiced anti-white sentiments that frightened and threatened the white establishment. Through slogans, symbols, and urban riots, Black America informed the nation that having lost faith in the system, they had established alternative black leadership and were committed to achieving black power. By the mid 1960s, religious attitudes and socioeconomic conditions had significantly changed for Jews in America. They had become the wealthiest and most influential political group in the nation. They had been accepted into the dominant society with practically unlimited mobility opportunities. They controlled a major share of wealth, businesses, professional, and management positions, government influence, and access to institutions of higher education. Having made remarkable social and economic achievements, Jews now had a philosophical base for becoming more conservative. The Black Power protest of the late 1960s moved many Jews closer to the right-wing conservative principles. Jews' increased conservatism was reflected in their reserved attitude towards the role of government. Previously, Jews and blacks were advocates for a strong governmental role in combating discrimination, alleviating the plight of the poor, and aiding social mobility, according to Tom W. Smith. In a 1990 article entitled Jewish Attitudes Towards Blacks and Race Relations, published in the American Jewish Committee's Jewish Sociology paper, Smith wrote that both Jews and blacks encourage government involvement to improve the lives of the social disadvantages through progressive measures such as the New Deal policies. From the 1930s to the 1950s, they used the legislators and the court system to pursue integration and broad intervention policies. But according to Smith's attitude survey, after blacks demanded specific governmental assistance, Jews changed their minds about the roles of government. For instance, Smith reported that today a majority of Jews do not favor government measures to help blacks, more government spending for blacks, or the use of busing to achieve school integration. In response to the specific question, does the government have a special obligation to improve blacks' living standards? More than 46% of Jews were opposed, and 26% were either neutral or undecided. So according to the Smith report, Jewish attitude on the question of the government's responsibility to assist a structurally handicapped group, such as Jews were years ago, had now turned 180 degrees. At the start of the 20th century, they were pro-government involvement. They were opposed. Harold Cruz, in his book Plural but Equal, offers his explanation for Jews turning towards conservatism and away from blacks. The opposition of Jewish liberalism to the threat of quotas showed that when power or enclaves are threatened sociologically and psychologically, the dominant white society will instinctively oppose, limit, and restrict such changes. And such manners are the avenues to social and economic power effectively maintained. When some Jews opposed the vehicle of quotas and affirmative action 3 decades ago, various Jewish organizations have worked to keep a dialogue going with the black community. Others have continued to feel alienated from blacks. Today, some Jews are upset because of the alignment of some members of the black communities with the Nation of Islam, which teaches that Jews have been just as oppressive and exploitive as blacks as any other white group. According to Smith, though there are heated tensions between the two groups and the ties are not as strong as they were in the early parts of the 1900s, Jews have a more positive attitude towards blacks than any other white group. Smith's survey further indicates that the most conservative group against blacks are Protestants and Baptist fundamentalists. Black labor, white wealth. Chapter 1. Government's conservatism alienates blacks. Anti-black conservatism from 1980 to 1992 served the fragile relationship that was beginning to build between blacks and government. The government established new priorities that reversed most of the progress made by blacks during the 1960s. It withdrew its marginal support of blacks for political and racial reasons, just as it did during the Reconstruction period following the Civil War. President Lyndon Johnson acknowledged the social and economic inequalities of black life. Through his Great Society program, he sought to do what government had failed to do during Reconstruction, to relieve the depressed conditions of black America by redistributing opportunities and self-development tools. But again, the larger society would not tolerate it. There was a backlash against all programs and policies that suggest wealth and power redistribution between whites and blacks. Conservative whites opposed public policies that mandated busing, affirmative actions, quotas, equal housing opportunities, set asides, and racial preferences. Conservatives insisted that their actions were not racist and they were committed to equal opportunities for blacks. The hypocritical difference between their rhetoric and actions was similar to the old line that everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. They proclaimed a belief in equality and parity for blacks, but they would not accept the measures that were needed to bring about the equality and parity. Richard Nixon, the presidential successor to Lyndon Johnson, rose into the highest public office in this nation on the conservative white backlash to Black Power protests in the late 1960s. Shortly after his 1968 election, his domestic advisor, Daniel Moynihan, sent out the first signal that the federal government was ready to use its power to put blacks back in their place by blaming them, not racism, for the breakdown of the black families and communities, as well as the widespread poverty and powerlessness that affected the black community. The conservatives' national goal was to abandon the civil rights agenda and move towards a colorblind society. In the 1970s, Moynihan issued his infamous benign neglect memorandum that announced the new public policy on blacks. The policy behind the memorandum moved attention away from the blacks, saying, "The time may have come when the issue of race could benefit from a period of benign neglect. We may need a period in which Negro progress continues and racial rhetoric fades." Moynihan's memorandum signaled that the old government policies of using blacks as cheap labor was ending and the new policies would declare blacks obsolete. Alfonso Pinckney, in his book The Myth of Black Progress, indicates that Moynihan's memorandum encouraged the supplanting of blacks with other ethnic groups. Moynihan wrote that greater attention to Indians, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Ricans would be useful. The government justified supplanting blacks by promoting the myth that Black Americans were making extraordinary progress. The nation swallowed the myth of black progress. Meanwhile, real change in Black America's conditions never even got off the ground. Most Black Americans did not agree with Moynihan's assignment that blacks had created their social ills through self-inflicted pathologies, and blacks didn't accept the government's claim that they were making extraordinary social and economic progress. Making progress compared to what and whom, they asked. History has taught blacks that they, not the powerful social and economic systems, are always blamed for their deplorable living conditions. Dominant societies believe that negative conditions for Black Americans are self-inflicted and is based upon the fact that the conditions that blacks endured are almost peculiar to blacks alone. White society has never been enthusiastic about helping blacks, nor has it permitted them to acquire the tools to help themselves. Blaming blacks for their underclass status keeps the larger society free from recriminations or obligations to blacks. Ironically, if the deplorable conditions of Black Americans were experienced by white America for even a short period of time, the government would not hesitate to declare a national disaster and activate emergency assistance measures. But since depressive socioeconomic conditions have been peculiar to Black America for centuries, no such governmental interventions is to be expected. Black Labor, White Wealth. Chapter 1: The Death of the Black Civil Rights Movement. For everyone but the caretaker of old black civil rights organizations, the civil rights movement for blacks is dead. Civil rightism for blacks had a brief life for the second time within a 100-year period, reached a point of diminishing returns, then died a premature death during the late 1960s. All of the rights gained by the civil rights movement have been bequeathed to groups that are more acceptable to the large society: women, gays, Hispanics, Asians, handicapped, and poor whites. The first black civil rights effort formally started shortly after the civil rights, as slaves realized that they had received paper freedom and unexercisable rights. For nearly a century, they pursued their phantom freedom and rights nationally by the way of public forums, courtrooms, schoolhouses, union halls, and journalism. In 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education desegregation decision, blacks won a battle, but the decision had incalculable destructive effects on the black community. During the subsequent civil rights protest period, blacks stimulated a rush of new social movements by a melange of social groups which piggybacked on black causes in their own quest for conservatives' ground. During the subsequent civil rights protest periods, blacks stimulated a rush of new social movements by a melange of social groups which piggybacked on black causes in their own quest for rights and freedoms. This offended the larger society in general and gave conservatives ground to orchestrate a backlash. Since blacks were the largest, most visible, and least acceptable group, they became the primary target of conservatives' angst. The movement was drowned out by new groups and outflanked by the conservatives. The heat of various civil rights battles for control over jobs, schools, housings, community services, businesses, and tax dollars, black leadership ran out of insight, social tools, and strategies for effectively dealing with the more subtle and less direct forms of racism that cropped up. As other groups began to take away from blacks' control of the civil rights agenda, conservatives' political forces started using their government and media power to diminish the black components of the civil rights movement. They successfully destroyed the legitimate base of the black movement by diluting the movement beyond recognition. They identified every group that could possibly perceive itself as aggrieved and made it equal to blacks. Thus, the public perception of blacks were severely damaged and distorted. The unique problems that they faced were made to appear no more important than the problems faced by other so-called victims of discrimination. The black civil rights movement, though spectacularly successful in many respects, had at least four major flaws that diminished the accomplishments of the movement and left critical imperatives for black America. The movement's black leadership focused its entire weight on resources on achieving integration. They believed, perhaps naively, that by removing all the symbols of Jim Crowism and acquiring access to various segments of white society, black people would gain equality. Black leaders failed to focus on neutralizing the forces behind Jim Crowism or developing effective strategies for black America to use in dealing with the problem that sprang forth from the maldistribution and racist control of wealth, power, and resources in America. They failed to develop a long term national plan with goals and strategies, spelling out where blacks ought to be going and how best to get there. In addition, black leaders failed to construct a national network of institutions to train new generations of blacks who could successfully assume leadership positions and implement a national plan for the black empowerment. The combined effects of these four major failures left the black civil rights movement with no place to go, no way to get there, and no leadership to take them. A few visible black organizations managed to survive by becoming politically correct and expanding their focus to include so-called minority, poor people, gays, women, and abused children. They could not survive in the powerful conservative climate by continuing to target the problems of blacks alone. Although black conditions continue to need attention, most black organizations could not raise enough money to survive by focusing solely upon their own people. The surviving black organizations remain visible to continue to pursue the integration dream. It would not have been necessary for black organizations to abandon their own community if the civil rights movement had established a sense of community cohesiveness founded on group economics and group politics. The National Urban League and the NAACP are still active, but they have lost much of their influence and membership. The Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and the Black Panther Party are defunct. The Congress of Racial Equality joined the conservative ranks of a national political party, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference barely survives. This nation's political apparatus disabled many of the civil rights groups by destroying or neutralizing black leadership. Adam Clayton Powell and Stokely Carmichael were discredited. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Medgar Evers were assassinated. Rap Brown, Eldridge Cleaver, Angela Davis, and prominent members of the Black Panther Party were criminalized. Many of the others were enticed into mainstream society. Consequently, the large block of black leadership was eradicated, changed, or disappeared after just one generation following the Great Movement. Having failed to address the structural conditions of black America, the 1960s left little structure upon which blacks could build. Instead, that colorful era only left faded memories and soul-stirring songs. The void created by the death of black civil rights presented the opportunity for a cadre of black neoconservatives to join the popular white conservatives movements and proclaim themselves and their new organizations the new black leadership. They were publicly blessed by the highest levels of government and corporate America, and they offered Black America political and economic ideologies that were taken right from the conservative right-wing political Bible. Their politically correct ideologies advocated less government and taxes, free market economies, privatization of government services, and race-neutral government policies. Black traditional leadership, like the black masses, was ignored by government and the media except during times of racial disturbances or anniversaries of the movement. Black Labor, White Wealth, Chapter 1, Conclusion. The problem of race and resources has been festering for hundreds of years, but has yet to arise as a core public issue in America. Whites have inherited the power and wealth of their ancestors through a social and economic structure designed and weighted to the advantage of non blacks. Blacks have inherited a legacy of permanent poverty and powerlessness. Black labor made the nation a strong, wealthy, international world power, but nothing has been proposed to seriously bring about remuneration, parity, or fairness to black people. It is clear that blacks must both solve their own problems and structure a national plan of action that puts their priorities first and foremost. Self empowerment is the only road to economic justice, but it requires the support of a national policy and plan of action.